This is Greg Owen, the CEO of the GOKO Group, and welcome. You know, I was going through all the different people I've interviewed over the past 4 or 5 years and had a look at all the greats and whatever, and something came out that was very, 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 very clear. And only one person has been absolutely accurate, just one. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to jump in and invite him back to all of the GOKO Group's crowd, because this guy has got it right. I like that. Now I've got Phil Anderson standing by. Phil, are you there? Can you hear me? I can see that you're muted. If you can unmute yourself as well.
Yeah. Hi, Greg. Yeah, I'm good. I'm here.
Phil, look, good to see you. How dare you be right? I mean, what's going on? I mean, Harry Dent, Robert Kiyosaki, Jim Rickards, God, Mark Boris, Martin North. I have gone over all of my old tapes. They've all said the property market was going to hell in a handbasket. Don't buy another property. You're going to lose your money. This was 3, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, some of them. And here we are. And the market continued to rise. I remember you and I and a whole bunch of people with Port Phillip Publishing 6, 7, 8 years ago in that stuffy bloody hotel suite, and you had a debate with Harry, and you said to Harry, and Harry said then, was it 2017 maybe? And Harry said that there's going to crash now. And you said, no, very calm and cool as you are, Phil. No, Harry, it's not going to crash until 26, 27. Now, Harry held his breath. He went red in the face, and, we had to give him oxygen. But Phil, what's going on? Why, how dare you be out of step with all these people?
Greg, we've got to stay humble about this. I'm only ever as good as my next forecast. That's the first thing. I don't have any magical crystal ball. What I do have is a knowledge of this. There are 3 things that are required to produce everything you see around you. So, you look around your own house, whatever it is, you have to have 3 things. You have to have land, labor, and capital. And I don't want to get into too much economic terms, but you need those 3 things to produce wealth. Now, from the beginning of the economists, David Ricardo and Adam Smith and forward, they all knew this. And in the mid 1800s, when all the American capitalists and the railroads came in and America really got going, it created a prodigious amount of wealth that was taken by just a couple of people, really, the Vanderbilts and the JP Morgans and the like, and the oil barons, Rockefeller and so. And there was a reform movement that came through that said that the wealth had to be better distributed. And one of those guys came through in the economic sphere. There was a lot. There was Sinclair, Upton Sinclair, and a few others. One of the guys was Henry George, and he came through and he showed that the land is really important, and land has an earnings, as labor does with wages and capital does with profits. Land has an earnings base too. It's called rent. If you collect that rent, if you allow everybody in the world to own the land, but because they are able to own the land, you owe the rent of the earnings of that land to the community. If that was put into practice, everybody would be rich. And this was found around about 1880, 1890, 1900s. This was found to be really offensive to the landlord class, to the capitalist classes, to those that were collecting the rent. And there was only a few families. And so a job was done with the economists just about 100 thereabouts. It's documented. I just happened to have it's it's a book called The Corruption of Economics. It's written by Mason Gaffney and a very famous fellow called Fred Harrison. In there, they documented how the concept of land was absolutely deliberately written out of economics. And so going forward from about 1920, a bit more, Mason Gaffney names the several economists. That's because the American institutions and the universities, they owned, and so did the railroads, owned a prodigious amount of land. So they wrote land out of the economy, out of economics. And every single person that's gone through the economics faculty since that time does not have a concept of land being a factor of production that produces wealth. And the results of that are seeing today, where you've got absolutely every mainstream economist that simply will never be able to forecast and will never get economics correct because they don't include land in their equation of economics. People go on about this QAnon, the conspiracy of everything else, and the politicians around the world now start arguing about this and that and all the conspiracy stuff. There really is only one conspiracy. That's that land's been written out of economics, and consequently, the Fed has 3, 4, 5,000 economists working for them. Not one of them. This is one of the biggest institutions in the world, and they don't know what's coming next, right? It's just never ceased to amaze me. So once you put land into the equation, you now have a complete picture of economics, and you know that because the earnings of land is permitted to capitalize into a price, you absolutely must get a real estate cycle. It's just absolutely 100%. And then now we've got a system where we allow the banks to create credit on this earnings of land, which has been capitalized into a price. That must create a volatility where land prices keep going up. And one final thing I can add to that, which the world doesn't get, once you see this, it's like being able to write. It's astounding. It just opens up a whole panorama of being able to actually see things before they happen. The earnings of land, which is now called land price, because the earnings, it's like a PE really. The price is the capitalized earnings, the PE. When the earnings of land capitalize into a price, the thing is, and this is what the early reformers knew, and David Ricardo proved this back in 1810. The earnings of land price must take the gains. So therefore, land price must go up. Absolutely must. 100% certain must go up. So the more discoveries we make, the more that people settle in big cities, the more things that people do, the more communal that we get, the higher land price must go. Greg, it's really, really simple. It really is. And my subscribers, and once they've seen it, it puts them on a road. It puts them on a completely different road than they've been on before. It just wakes them up.
Phil, by the way, everybody, we're going to cut for some questions, not to, in about 10 or 15 minutes, and start to compile your questions in the chat box and I'll read them out. I'll obviously won't get to all questions, but as many as we can. So please start thinking up some questions and maybe make your questions a bit broader. I've had people in the past say, I live in Burnie in Tasmania. Will my property value go up? Maybe a little bit broader than that. Let's hope that everybody can join in with the question. So please, I want questions. It'd be fantastic. Phil, you've been living and dying by this 18.6 year cycle. Obviously, you have no intentions to change your mind. You really still believe that's going to happen. But we've now got all sorts of red herrings. We've got this possibility of war in Israel, and this can be a bit more serious than other wars and nasty. That's number one. But the other, challenge is that in China, they have this underbelly of disturbance with the Evergrande and with the country garden developer. And it smells. It's really on the nose. And you would think something that size bring down the world. So I'd love your thoughts on the war, the possible challenges in Israel, and also about these challenges in China.
Yeah, Greg, good questions, and it opens up a lot of things that I that should be commented on. Let me digress for just 1 minute to give you an example of how little economists understand things, and then I'll answer the things about war and China. Since 1955, the Fed has consistently lifted interest rates in a series of moves, not just a one-off, in a series of moves 11 times. So since 1955, interest rates have gone up 11 times. 10 of those times, house prices continued to go up. The other time, house prices just went sideways, and that was way back in the late 1950s. You know, we're in a slightly different era now. This is what nobody gets. So when you look at the statistics, when you look at the history, when interest rates come down, house prices go up. When interest rates go up, house prices go up as well. And so when the economy is improving, and you can see this right throughout history, right back to the Fed, and actually when the Fed wasn't in existence, economists understood that when interest rates were going up, they were going up for a reason, because the economy was really strong. And so this is what the Fed are doing. The economy is strong, they have to lift interest rates. And when the economy is really strong, house prices will continue to go up. I'm absolutely staggered that people can't, that economists, mainstream, anybody else can't understand this. And so when you put the American house prices, when you match them against interest rates, you see that interest rates usually go up pretty much in the middle, the second half of the real estate cycle. House prices will continue to go up because the economy is really strong. So economists don't get it, right? And then you'll get the media coming out, putting up all these sorts of propositions and being really emotional, and they'll panic everybody, right? But I'm telling you, history shows that when interest rates go up, house prices generally go up. Now, having said that, well, anyway, let me answer you. Let me move on to the questions of war and China.
Yeah.
I'm old enough now to remember a couple of real estate cycles. I urge people watching to go back and check up a little bit of history. So you do that in roughly 19, 20-year cycles, roughly. All these numbers, I know it's a bit hard when I bring out all these numbers, but have a look what happened in 2001, 2, and 3, and 4. You have a look what happened in 1982, 83, 84, and you have a look what happened in the 1960s. And just briefly, in 2001, 2, and 3, what was going on? Iraq. Firstly, 9/11, which absolutely was scary. Really, nobody knew what the Americans were going to do once the towers came down. And then 2003, they decided to go into Iraq. That was scary. Absolutely. The news back then, absolutely everybody thought World War III was going to start, because the Americans were angry. They'd woken a sleeping giant, which is exactly what happened in 1941, 42, and 43 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. It was the same expression being used, waking a sleeping giant. You go back and have a look, 1982, 83, 84, and all these things I'm talking about is the second half of the real estate cycle. So in 1983, Lebanon was involved. The Americans then went into Libya and started bombing Libya. And I specifically remember that because I was trying to travel the world back then, and I couldn't get into the Middle East because the Americans were absolutely angry about what the Lebanese and the Iranians were doing with bombing American embassies and all the other stuff and stuff. In the 1960s, the bogeyman was Cuba, and so what was the American? And I think in this instance, I reckon it's the American military establishment. They are interested in fostering war, and it's very easy to foster war when you've got a group of people in the Middle East that don't want peace. So all you got to do is rile them a little bit, because they get angry really quickly, and you get a situation like we have today when we've got war stuff. Right now, I urge readers and listeners, I urge them to have a really good look at what was happening in the Middle East and Israel and a bit of the Palestinian situation. Now, I don't want to get too political about this because people get hot-headed about what's happening. I want you to watch it from an economic viewpoint. Israel developed and ended up in the last couple of months with a right-wing politician that had to go even more extreme and invite extremists, total extremists, and every side has extremists, right? And they're a minority, but he invited extremists into his cabinet, and he did that because he had to keep himself out of jail, and they took their eye off the ball. Now, that is a typical second half of the real estate cycle scenario. Now, picture what might happen in the US, right? You now have a former president that has to get elected to keep himself out of jail, and he is turning more and more right-wing extremist. And he will invite those sort of people into his own cabinet, yes? And as you go into the second half of the real estate cycle, and we get up to 2026, it may happen that everybody will be watching the exact thing that they don't want to be watching, because this is what the media will feed you. When you go into the next few years of the cycle, you have to understand the cycle, and you have to be watching the earnings of land. So as I explained at the beginning, economists don't watch this, though they'll never tell you what you need to know, because newspapers would be full of absolute rubbish and garbage and emotional stuff that gets you really riled up. And it's, in my view, it's a little bit deliberate, and it gets you away from what it is you need to know. Okay, so interest rates, nobody ever tells you what happened in history. War, the war stuff. Well, I've explained it now, so you get to know what's got to come and what you got to watch for the next couple of years. Now let me turn to China. Greg, the Chinese people know that the Chinese media is propaganda. They know, yes? There are too many people in the West that forget that Western media is also propaganda. It's controlled by just a couple of people now. By a couple of very big news media outlets now, and what gets put into the papers is basically to fill the space between advertisements that you want to watch. So they've got to fill it with something, and they're not going to fill it with what they don't want you to read. It's what the stuff is in there that they want you to know about. It's not controlled. It's just that, and now you've got the situation where you've got Israel and Palestine, Hamas at war. Now you're going to see the Western propaganda go into absolute overdrive. Now, I've traveled the world. I've lived in places that are Muslim denominated, and it's very interesting to do that, because when you do, if you look around Malaysia and Indonesia and other sorts of places, what you see all around the nation, all around the country, is billboards saying "Free Palestine." Can you imagine what might happen if I decided to pay for a billboard in the middle of Melbourne or Sydney that says "Free Palestine"? It would be absolute chaos, and I'd probably go to jail and have to take it down. Now, this is not me making a political comment about one side or the other. I'm just trying to get your listeners and other people, wake up. It's propaganda. And so the whole war thing is, now you're going to get the military industrial complex. They love this because they've now got to manufacture a lot more bullets, and you'll get the politicians and all of the diplomats. They'll all come together now to try and de-escalate the situation. They love that too, because it puts them in the public eye. It makes them famous. They get all the news media coverage, and hopefully, if one of them can actually develop something that might even go anyway towards de-escalating the conflict, he'll be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. The whole thing is shite. I'll tell you, it's just absolute constructions that you've got to watch within the concept of the 18.6-year real estate cycle. Now, that brings me to China and a little bit of stuff, right? The Chinese side's propaganda, the Western side's propaganda, but the question you have to ask yourself, which nobody does, is what happens if President Xi gets it right? What happens if what he's doing does get it right? I think what he's done now with real estate in China, with Evergrande and with the couple of firms that were like that, they had to be brought down to earth because they were the world's most indebted companies. And I think he's done that in a measured, smart sort of way. And he's moving the economy to electric vehicles, to consumer stuff that the Chinese middle class have to do. If he gets that right, and he may not, but if he does, if he gets that right, it could make China the biggest economy in the world. This is a real threat to the US, and America does not want them to get that right. Hence, they're doing the stuff they're doing with semiconductors and everything else, where they're making it really hard for China to do right. I mean, let's face it, in history, Americans, as they were developing as a power, they stole all of the UK's secrets to all of the cotton gin and all the other stuff, right? So it's not as if America hasn't done its own stealing of technology. But in one sense, the Americans are quite right too. You can't have the Chinese stealing technology and chips that they didn't make, which they are doing. But the question you've got to ask is not whether the Chinese economy is going to collapse because they've got one or two heavily indebted property developers that really do have to be in check. The question you might ask is, what if Xi gets this right? And he may. And the other thing I wanted to say, and thanks Greg for letting me make a couple of comments. The American economy and the Chinese economy, they're not really very different. It is, both of them, based on land. In China, the way they've developed, you've had local governments there selling off land to developers to develop housing, which China desperately needed, and they've done very well over the last 30 years, and it's made Australia very rich. America, the local councils, they mostly the land's been farming. The local council, when a developer wants to put some houses up, he buys the farm, he goes to the local council, he gets that designated as land for housing, and they build housing and they develop housing. The process is exactly the same, isn't it? The thing in America is that the developer is done by private, and so the developer will put his own men on council to make sure he gets the results, which allows government to become corrupted. In China, the development is done by local government, so people have to get onto local government because it's a prodigious amount of money that gets earned, and then you dangle in front of them the local councillors in China that can run off with some of the money. It's absolutely massive stuff. What's the difference? It's exactly the same process. One's communist, one's capitalist, but it's still based on land. Nobody gets it.
Phil, your 18.6 year cycle, obviously that means 26, 27, right?
If history is to repeat, yes.
Okay.
And it's a pretty calculations, 14 years up, 4 down. American real estate bottomed in 2012. Pretty bloody simple.
Look, I asked for questions. I've got about 36 already, so we may be here for 24 hours, but we won't be able to get to them all. So how will it fold out? Let's use Australia, because I know there's people from around the world on with us at the moment, but most of the people here are from Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand's already having a little bit of a crack in their real estate. It's dropped 20 or 30%. I don't know if you want to comment on that also, but the other thing I was going to say is, what do you see that will happen in Australia? Let's use the capital city, Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. What are we going to see? A 20, 30% drop?
I don't mean to be flippant, but once you get outside Australia, nothing much happens in Australia. I don't mean to say that meanly.
Wash your mouth out with soap, Phil.
Australia doesn't lead the cycle. So really, Australia is just not going to turn down until America does. And it's the US you have to follow. The thing about Australia is it's just got so much land that's available. It just can keep expanding virtually indefinitely. America in the same way, sort of. But the cycle, historically, the cycle shows that the US from 1800, 1774, the Industrial Revolution, once land was really started to be enclosed in the US, it gave rise to a cycle. And, as I put in my book, Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, history reveals that there is an approximate 18 to 20 year cycle of land prices, earnings of land going up for 14 or so years, and then they reach a pinnacle, and then they seem to collapse for a couple of years. That just seems to be the way it is. And so far, 2012 or so, as you know, we've been speaking for more than a decade now. I've stuck to that forecast. I've stuck to that to say property prices would continue to go up. The cycle can never happen exactly the same way. It has to be different. Otherwise everybody would see it. You know, we got a bit of a pandemic after 2020. The problem's never been interest rates going up as they have the past year. The problem really was they just went too low for too long, and they had to come back up at some particular point, because you can't have interest rates at zero forever, because money, something has to cost a little bit to borrow. So here we are. So there will be some places when property prices went up so high because interest rates were put down so low, you have to get a reaction, and when prices do go up, you get a reaction in certain places, and that's just all part of the cycle. But the US drives the cycle, and if history is to repeat, we'll get a history like what happened from 2003 to 2007. They were big years. People forget, but the property prices practically doubled. A repeat of 1983 into 87, 88, property prices did double in that late 1980s. Prices doubled again in the late 1960s. So if we get that 20-year repeat, then we're on track. And so, here we are at the moment. We've been through heaps, and I still think, I've been able to say when we get to here, it's property prices would keep going up in average. They have pretty much, certainly in the US. And, in the US, you've got a lot of mortgaged borrowers that a little bit different to Australia. They're still on low rates, and they'll be on low rates for the life of the mortgage. So the problem we've got in America is that a lot of people on a mortgage in America can't shift because they're on such a low mortgage, they'd have to take out a high one to shift, which is creating a shortage of housing. So things are in place, I think, for the cycle to repeat. We'll just have to see what happens.
Okay, look, I'll grab a few questions as we go. I see Jamie is saying you're predicting a crash in 26, 27. Property may continue to go up, but then it will likely fall. Do any gains will disappear then? And with interest so high, you can't get positive gearing anymore. So question is, best to hold off buying property until after the next.
That's a difficult question to answer, because I don't know people's individual circumstances.
Yeah.
What I always say is that if you don't own a house, if you don't own a land, I think you get any time's a good time to get in, because I think you've got to get security of tenure. And so over the next couple of years, you just make sure that you can afford the mortgage. And I think for people that don't own anything, get in. Greg, I bought my first house in the 1980s. The interest rate was 18%, or 17.5%, I think it was. And I thought that was cheap, because house prices were going up faster than interest rates.
Well, at 5 and 6%, it's very cheap.
Yes. So it's all relative. But I get the point. It is all relative. And so land and house prices now, when I talk about house prices, it's land price. House prices have gone up now so much because, of course, they go up when interest rates come down. So everything's been capitalized into the land and house prices. So interest rates now at 4, 5, 6% does seem high because land prices are so high. So it of course does always come down to earnings. And I appreciate the fact that you can't get earnings enough on the house to cover the rate of interest. So, well, yes, no, but you've just got to keep looking out for stuff. It's just, it is how it is, right? Difficult questions to answer there, because I can't give investment advice, so I don't know people's individual circumstances. But just got to make the earnings and the yields work. Just go from there.
So what you're saying is that
what I'm also like to suggest too is stop worrying about the crash, which may or may not happen, because we get to 2026, 2027. The debts are so high now. And if we do get a vicious president getting into the US, whoever's the president, the only way they might get out of the move down, which I think by now is inevitable, because the interest rates, the land prices have gone so high and the debts are so high, might be war. So, and that would be bullish for things really in one sense, but bad for the people fighting.
So as you said to me, or you've said to me in the past, when it comes off the boil, it'll come off the boil, but when it's ready for its next jump, look out. It could be
Yes.
very,
Yeah.
very big, and you want to be
Yes.
on that train.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think so. So I'm not, the world's not going to end.